So I'll be talking today a little bit about court life in the Joseon Dynasty. And to begin, we'll look at the palace, which would be the center of life at this time. And the main palace was Cheongdeok Palace. It was the second of the 5 grand palaces built during the Joseon Dynasty. And it's a large complex covering 110 acres with about 38 different buildings and pavilions. It was the residence favored by the princes and also was the place where Prince Sato lived and died. And from the palace, they would conduct their foreign affairs. The approach was taken from the Chinese model, where the king was seen as higher in ranking than any other foreign ruler or anybody from a different country. And so, with that, even the dignitaries or whoever was coming to have an audience with the king, they'd be put into different ranks according to their status in their own country. So like a general would be treated not quite as nicely as a king or an emperor from a neighboring country. And the main reason they do this is they'd be having deals with foreign dignitaries from Japan, China, and the Ryukyu Islands. And it was, what I found interesting was they'd set up like a tributary system, or they'd request to have the Koreana Tripitaka made copies and given to them. Another thing they would do is send goodwill missions to Japan. And we have a little, they've done a reenactment recently. And we're going to watch a little video of that.
올해는 조선통신사가 최초로 일본을 출발한 지 또 400년이 되는 해인데요. 한국과 일본이 함께하는 조선통신사 문화교류 사업의 일환으로 400년을 맞이한 조선통신사 3사 임명식 제헌이 있었습니다. 조선통신사는 정사, 부사, 공사관의 중앙관리로 구성된 3사와 문인, 예술가, 공연가, 의사 등 500여 명 정도의 규모였으며 한양을 출발해 일본 애도까지 왕복 1만 1천 이에프를 왕래했다고 합니다. 조선통신사는 우리의 글과 그림, 미술, 음악 등 여러 분야에 걸친 앞선 문화를 전달하여 일본 문화에 상당한 영향을 끼쳤습니다.
조선통신사는 과거에 우리 한류 문화를 일본에 전파한 최초의 문화적 충격이었다고 생각합니다.
여 년의 세월을 넘어 창경궁 영정전에서 제헌된 3사 임명식. 국왕이 직접 정사와 부사, 공사관을 임명하고 고지를 내리는 행사인데요. 조선의 궁중의식 주정식인 국조 오례의에 따라 엄격한 고증을 거쳐 제헌되었습니다. 임명식이 끝난 후 인사동 거리에서는 조선통신사 행렬을 제헌하는 거리 행진이 벌어졌으며 수많은 사람들의 시선을 끌었습니다. 다음 달 초 부산에서는 조선통신사가 일본으로 떠날 때 방송통신사 평화의 행렬은 다채로운 기념 축제가 열릴 예정입니다.
과거의 역사적인 사건을 미래를 향한 교과서를 삼는 것. 이것이야말로 역사가 가지고 있는 참된 의미라고 생각합니다.
이 문화의 우수성을 전파하며 한일 문화 교류의 장을 열었던 조선통신사. 400년을 맞이한 이 행렬을 통해 한일 역사 속의 평화 메시지가 일본인들에게 전달되기를 바랍니다.
Okay, so it's also interesting to note that even though they did these goodwill missions, Japan would send false trade envoys. They'd say that there was a king in the Ryukyu Islands that was requesting trade rights with Korea, and even sometimes they used kings that had barely died, so they wouldn't know that it wasn't him going to request trade. And then there was many methods that were used to stop the fraud. Like they'd have different strips with a seal on it. They'd have to have those matched. And this, at one time, this method was actually suggested by the Japanese, which were doing this false trading. It's hilarious. And then we will talk a little bit about the Confucian influences in family life. It's very obvious from reading memoirs of the period that Confucianism was very strong in the court. They were all based on the 5 basic Confucian relationships of king and subject, father, son, etc. And the king would make regular trips to ancestral shrines and tombs to make sacrifices and stuff. And there'd be many ceremonies, like the capping ceremony, as you were growing older. And in the memoirs of Lady Haegyeong, it's interesting to hear how regulated life was in the court. You'd have to go, like she would have to go every few days to visit the king and queen to show her filial piety towards the king and queen. And the same with Prince Sato and anyone in the royal family. Another interesting thing I found out was when it came to the marriage of the crown prince, the parents would choose that it was time for the crown prince to get married, and then they'd have a process of selection over a few months where they see how virtuous was she, how like they'd look at her qualities and see how that would be good for the nation. And before she was married, she'd be taken to the palace and she'd live in a separate pavilion for like a few weeks until the marriage ceremony was taking place. And there was also a huge emphasis on education. The princes were encouraged to study the Confucian classics. They'd have their royal lectures every day. And the greatest tragedy in the dynasty is the death of Prince Sato. He actually served as Prince Regent for 14 years during the reign of King Monjo. His wife said he had a very filial and good nature, because he would always obey his father, no matter what he would ask him to do. Like, he'd ask him if he did something wrong, he'd tell him. And his wife said that his mental illness was largely due to his father's neglect and extreme criticism. Because when Prince Otto was really young, he was moved into the Crown Prince's residence, and he wouldn't see his parents for days. And so most of his social interaction would be with his servants. And when this resulted in him being less virtuous than his father would like, his father would criticize him, and this would really upset Prince Otto. And where was it? Oh yeah. And his father, like, if his father had to go to a hearing about a murder or something, he'd go to his son and see how he was doing, so he would be cleansed of that stain of having to go to a murder trial. And so all this treatment really affected him, and he started killing people. And it was really scary for everyone in the court, especially after it was obvious that King Yonjo loved his son more than the crown prince. And so they'd have to edit the records of the royal lectures so Prince Otto wouldn't see the things like his son. Just so they could protect the only heir to the throne after Prince Otto. And later, after his death, his son and grandson memorialized him, and he was raised to the status of a king. So in conclusion, we can see that court life had a large influence of Confucianism, which included its approach to foreign affairs, ruling style, education, and family life. And this Confucian influence was not only prevalent in court, but it was something which influenced the nation as a whole, whose influence is still felt today.